Okay, welcome everybody, and especially those that are watching this on video. I'm going to be giving this Industry Insight lecture today. Now, I'm Ray Dawson. I'm from the University of Loughborough. Now, you might think that's a little bit of a fraud because this is supposed to be an insight into industry, and here am I, an academic. But I do actually have an industry background myself. When I was even at university, I was working as part of my research studies there with a real company, working on the software for that company. I then moved to a company called Plessey Telecommunications, and there I was a software engineer for 6 years, developing the software inside telephone exchanges before moving to the training centre there to help train new people coming into the company, and in particular, often a lot of new graduates coming to the company. But even for the last 28 years, when I've been here at the university, I have actually been working with industry to a large extent, because a lot of my research is based around what industry does, because I've always had this interest in working practices in industry. And many of my PhD students have either been members of employees of a company, or else they've been PhD students sponsored by the company, and they will spend most of the time at their company. So I'm finding out what's actually going on inside the company itself. I am actually a member of the Knowledge Management Research Group here at the University of Loughborough, but many of the things covered today are actually things that apply to any IT development, and I'm particularly interested in the implementation of systems, whether they be knowledge management systems or any other type of system. And that's what I'm going to cover today, and I'm going to talk about some of the case studies that we have experienced working with companies across the country, a lot of them in the East Midlands, of course. So let's start off with one, if you like, my starting point of the things I'm going to cover today. I was working with a company called the Danwood Group. I had a PhD student working with them as well, and we had a very broad remit there. We were just basically told, okay, you're a specialist in knowledge management, find some way of making the company better. Now, that was an interesting thing to do, so we thought, well, okay, we'll have to have a go at that. So what we did, we thought, okay, how do we start something like this? And we came up with an immediate, we need to start with a knowledge audit. Now, what is a knowledge audit? Well, a knowledge audit is simply a means of saying, well, okay, what's the situation now? Where is the knowledge? Who has it? Is it inside their heads? Is it on databases? How is it held? What form is it in? Who uses it? Where does it flow? How do I get the knowledge from one place to another around the company? All of these things are part of a knowledge audit. And the idea is we can find out our starting point. We can discover where the problems are, where the inefficiencies are. We can find what problems exist in the current systems. So that is what we did. And we actually had quite an early success. Right at the beginning, we saw two systems. One was called the Customer Relationship Management System, and that is a standard customer relationship management system which basically keeps details of all your customers, especially new prospects, new business that are coming in, but also some existing customers where we expect to get more business in the future. So this data was kept on customers in one particular database and one particular system. But there was another system, the Customer Query Logging System. Now, the Customer Query Logging System is where they already had a product, but maybe there was a little fault on it, or there was some question they had about it. Maybe they were asking about what its capabilities were, in which case they kept a lot of details about the customer there. Aha, we thought. An obvious overlap. Could we do something to make this a bit more efficient and a bit more effective? Well, yes, we could. We came up with a proposal. If we merge these two systems together, there could potentially be some cost benefit. There'd be only one system to maintain. We were able to measure the costs of the current operation with the two systems. We were able to predict the cost for the merged system, and we could see, yes, there were some savings to be made. We estimated the costs and we estimated the savings, and we put it to the board of the company. And the board of the company accepted it. Yes, success, a nice early success. Because we'd done everything right. We'd started systematically and analysed our problem and come up with a solution which was costed out. So, a success. We wrote some papers on it, in fact. But was it? Because we were continuing to work with the company, we were able to go back and ask them how it was getting on. After 6 months, nothing had happened. A little bit disappointing, but we kept contact. After 1 year, nothing had happened. Hello, that's a bit strange. After 2 years, nothing had happened. What had gone wrong? Clearly, the company, they eventually admitted they were never going to do it. This was a bit of a shock to us because we thought we had a nice successful system here. This system had clearly failed before it had even started. Something clearly had gone wrong. And yet it was actually a good learning point for us because we were able to see that actually there was a lot in this that was not necessarily to do with technical things that can actually lead to failure or success depending on how you treat things right at the beginning. The reasons for failure in this particular case, we went back in and we analysed the situation, find out what it's all about. And what happened basically, the company, being a normal company, had lots of problems. But the problem we'd identified wasn't one they even knew about. It wasn't a problem that they owned, if you see what I mean. It was a new problem we were telling them about. So, yeah, they agreed to do it, but they allocated the lowest priority to it. Now, if you've worked with industry before, you know that if something is the lowest priority, the chances of it ever happening are pretty well nil. And that's exactly what happened to us. Our wonderful proposal was never going to happen because the company just wasn't bothered. They just didn't care about it enough. We'd clearly gone wrong. Well, where had we gone wrong? Was it our starting point, the knowledge audit? Well, to a large extent, yes, it was. Knowledge audits can have a purpose, but not for starting off like we were doing here. Why find new problems when your customer has plenty of problems anyway? They don't want to know about new problems. They want solutions to the problems they've got. So it'd probably be a lot better to just search your company and find out what is it that's bothering them. What are the managers losing sleep over? That is the sort of question you've got to be able to address. What's bugging people? Well, this was, as I say, a learning point for us. We found out that there were a number of things like this that can actually affect the success or failure of an organisation or company right from the beginning. And in fact, even before you start implementing a system, there are a number of things you should do first. And I'm going to look at a few other case studies associated with this learning curve and what we did along the way. So the first step, clearly, just find what problem it is that you're trying to solve. If you don't know what problem it is, and it's got to be a recognised problem that everybody recognises, otherwise no one's going to be interested, find out what that problem really is so that you know what it is you're trying to tackle. Second step then, which is one that's often overlooked, okay, we've got a problem, but how bad is it? Let me illustrate that with a particular problem from Rolls-Royce. Now, this was the Rolls-Royce that makes the nuclear power plants for submarines, not the aero engine division. Basically, they had a problem there. They had what they call configuration data. Every single sub out there with its nuclear power plant had lots of different components, and they had all the components listed down to the last bolt, but it was not in one place. Some of it was in drawings, some of it on databases, some of it was in people's heads. And engineers working on the maintenance of these things, they had to search around to find the information they needed. That was the problem. But how bad was it? Well, we went in and we started talking to people to find out. How long? We asked a few of them. How long did you typically have to search to find what you needed? How often did you have to do that? And we were very soon able to get an estimate of what the loss was that their company was making just looking for that information. Turned out it was £5.25 million every year. That was a bad problem. That was a problem needing solving. Okay, so what's the next step? Well, this way I'm going to be deliberately a little bit vague because it can be a whole talk in its own right. But basically, you need to find some form of solution. Now that you've identified a problem and you know it's a bad one, you've got to find a solution that's going to work for that particular problem. And you need to be able to think outside the box a little bit. Let's look at another problem. This was a problem was for a Swedish company. They made things like handbags, crockery, various things that you would get in a high market retail store. Well, I say they made it. They didn't really make it. They had an outpost in India that actually made it. They did the designs back in Sweden. Now, the problem they had was a communication problem. They would do their design, they would communicate their design, they might send the drawings themselves out to India. The Indians would look at it, they would build something, they would send it back. The Swedish would look at it, not quite what we want. We wanted something that was a bit this way or a bit that way. So they adjust the instructions and send it back to India, and it would often take a few iterations to find out what they really needed. This was inefficient and it was slow. So we looked at it and said, well, look, how can we solve this particular problem? So what we did is we actually took some off-the-shelf software in the end. It was virtual reality software. You could build a model in virtual reality. This meant that the Indians, when they got it, they could have a look at it, they could revolve it round, look at it at different angles, get a close-up of what they wanted, and they could get a much better idea about what it was all about. Now, normally speaking, you wouldn't think of virtual reality as being communication software, but in this context, it was a communication software that solved the particular problem we had. And so that's the sort of thing you've got to try and do. Now, the important thing is, now that we've come up with a solution, and remember, we've also costed out how bad the problem was, that leads you on to the next step, where you can do a cost-benefit analysis. And you can work out, okay, given this solution, what's it mean to us in terms of the return on the investment we would have to make to install it? And that in itself was really quite an important step because it helps convince people. But it's not everything. So let's come on to the next step. Okay, even if you have a problem of which you've got a cost-effective solution, is it good enough? You've got to look at it from everybody's point of view, including the users. The people have to put in information and data into the system, as well as the ones that take it out. Those are the ones you have to look at it as, from their point of view as well. And I'm going to give an example here the manager was from AstraZeneca, the big pharmaceutical company. Actually, I think the experience came from a previous job he had, which was somewhere else. Now, basically, their particular problem was just sharing the knowledge that they had, just giving people a means to share, but they weren't doing it because they didn't have an incentive, so they created an incentive to allow for this sharing. What they did is they invented a system which he called knowledge miles. Every manager was given a whole set of knowledge miles which they could give to any other manager that gave them some information or some knowledge which they considered to be valuable. If they thought it was very valuable, they'd give them more miles. If it was only slight value, they'd just give them some miles. And the incentive was that because the company backed this, at the end of the year, if you'd acquired lots of knowledge miles, you could actually trade that for air miles, and maybe you got a holiday on the cheap as a result. So there was a definite financial incentive to doing it. Okay, a slightly bizarre system, but it worked for them. So you try and get buy-in for your solution now. You've got to get buy-in from two different sources. You've got to get buy-in from the senior management. Well, if I go back to my example of the submarines there was no problem getting buy-in from the senior management. 5.25 million being lost every year. Our solutions, whatever it came up, it was sponsoring a PhD student. It doesn't cost 5.25 million to sponsor a PhD student to come up with a solution. So clearly, they were bought into it straight away. Now, what about the individuals? Well, we came up with a potential solution for them. I won't go into the details now. But we were able to show not just the management, but also the users. Because they were wasting so much time and they didn't like wasting time, there was actually something in it for them as well. So in this particular case, we were able to show that they were gaining as well. The users were gaining. So in fact, we got buy-in all the way around. Still not everything though. You've got to look at the users themselves and how they're involved in the system. I'm going to give an example now from the military. Again, it was a student that was doing this particular one. And he was looking at a particular system that the Army, the Air Force and the Navy had merged their separate systems into one. Or that was the plan. And they outsourced it to another company, whose name I won't mention, to do it for them. I won't say what the actual system was. It's probably secret anyway. But anyway, the point is, this outsourcing company looked at the requirements, built the system, they delivered it on budget, and all right, it was a little bit late, but it was only a few months late. And actually, for the military, that is pretty good. So they were pretty keen on this. They had a successful system. They were pretty pleased with themselves. So we went in and we made some inquiries to find out what the situation is. What we discovered was, it was the most quoted reason for malcontent in the armed forces today. That came from one of the high-up brass in there, in the military. Obviously, something wasn't right. Clearly, normally, a system that was delivered to spec, on time, in budget, that's normally successful, but something was wrong. And it was all because they hadn't taken the users properly into account. And there's two ways in which they failed to do that. The first one is they didn't talk to the users about the user interface. It wasn't so much user unfriendly, it was more user hostile. It was really very difficult to use for the average user who would be using it. But the second thing which they also failed to do was to manage the expectations behind it. Because the users were expecting something more or less like their old systems used to do. In fact, this new system empowered the users. They were able to do more, but they weren't expecting that. They were confused, and because the interface was unfriendly, they were even more confused. And as a result, they were exceedingly unhappy about it. They hadn't talked to the users enough to get them on board, either in terms of their expectations or, in fact, their actual use of the interface. This is where things like agile programming really helps, because systems for agile programming involve interaction with the customer all the time. So it's a good step forward in that respect. Well, my next step also, the last one here, also involves the same organisation. The next step is to make sure you plan for the change and also plan for the support of after it's running as well. We'll come back to our military here. What we found is that they not really considered the fact that it's going to be something different for the users. There was a help desk there, because there'd been a help desk there before. But the help desk was woefully inadequate for what was needed. We did some inquiries. We found there were over 1,000 complaints. Not about the new system, but about the help desk. It was just so bad. Now, clearly you've got to put the support in. Change takes time, change takes effort. You can't bring change in without giving it some proper support. Not just for immediately after the implementation, but also thereafter. You've got to have those in there as well. So that's the 8th step, the things you must make sure you do before you even start implementing things. And once you've done all that, finally, if you like, a 9th step is then you can start implementing it. So what we've discovered is there are a number of things that can affect the success and failure, and they're not necessarily technical. Obviously, I haven't talked about technical aspects, and clearly those can cause a system to fail. But often it's nothing to do with the technical side. It's other sides as well, and you've got to be aware of all of those. So I'm going to put you to the test now. We're going to do a case study exercise. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask for the video recording to be stopped. We'll pause it while we'll actually take part in this exercise. So those watching on the video, you can either do this exercise as an in-class group, that's what we're going to do here in Loughborough, or you can split into small groups, or you can even do this one on your own if you're just looking at the video on your own. And then you're going to be asked 2 questions at different times. We'll come back in between. The first question is, given this particular problem, the particular scenario, will it work? And then the second question after that was, well, what would you do? So let's have a look at the scenario. This was a large computer company. They specialised in providing complete solutions for the customer, both hardware and software. They were solution providers. Now, they had, we were looking at a department of about 100 people. And some of those people were experts. They'd been doing it for years. They had a lot of expertise. They knew what sort of thing to bring together to solve a particular problem. But we also had a lot of novices in the whole situation as well. And they were not so experienced, and they didn't know all the different things that you could do. So it's a classic problem. How do you transfer that knowledge from those experts, the people who've been there for a while, to the people who have just come in or just don't know as much? Well, this is what the company came up with. They looked at this and said, well, okay, let's create an IT system, and we're going to capture all the things, all the decisions, all the setups that we've done from the past. Being an IT company, they can do this relatively straightforward. What they will do is they'll capture the details of the requirements, and we'll capture what the actual solution was. And then that can be used as a reference point for everybody in the future. Now, in fact, because we can capture what the actual solution was, because you can just hook it up to the sales database, that bit can come in automatically. And so all the users would have to do is just put in what the requirements were so that these could be matched up later on. So building this system, they worked out, because they're a computer company, they can do this at pretty effective costs. It wouldn't take them too difficult, it wouldn't be too difficult for them to do, and they certainly had the capability of doing it. So, here's the question. Will it work? Okay, so you've all considered it now, and those there watching this on video, I hope have considered it as well. Let's look at some of the things that we looked at when we first came across this problem, because we went in and talked to them and found out a bit more about it. First thing was, alarm bells started ringing pretty early on. The size and the scope of this problem hadn't been determined at all. Okay, so the novices were having problems. Well, how bad was that? Was this causing major errors or not? Unless you know how bad it is, how can you measure up what's worth doing? They'd come up with a solution, but they'd only come up with one solution. They hadn't thought about anything else, and they'd done their standard thing as a computer company, throw technology at it. Would it actually solve the problem? There were certainly some issues there. And one of the things that we discussed here at Loughborough, it was pointed out that if you're going to capture everything, you will capture everything. You'll capture those problems that are never going to be reused again, as well as problems that are going to be reused again. You're capturing both. And in fact, when we asked them, when we talked to the experts, they actually said roughly 10% would ever be reusable of their decisions. Well, in that case, 90% of what we're capturing is of no use, and that's going to get in the way because people can't even see, it's harder to find things when there's 10 times too much information there. No alternatives have been even thought about. Clearly, if we've got a simple problem like this, the novices are having a problem, maybe you just need to improve your training scheme. Would that solve it? It might be more cost effective. How do you know unless you've looked and costed these out? And we'd also identified the fact that nobody had asked the users. We actually talked to the users, and we very quickly identified that the experts, the ones that would have to put all the data into the system, those experts were prepared to help the novices, providing it didn't take up much time, because they are front-line people. They are the people dealing with the customers. They are the ones probably on bonuses for getting it right. They're not going to want to spend a huge amount of time just inputting data that they themselves will get very little benefit from. The novices will get lots of benefit from it, but they're not the ones that you want to input the data. So it's not been considered from the user's point of view. Let's look at the 8 steps. Was this a recognised problem? Yes. They knew it was a problem, and they recognised it, and they were worried about it. How bad was it? They hadn't worked that out. They couldn't work out how bad it was, so they didn't know how much it cost. Had they done an IT solution? Had they come up with a solution? I'm going to give them half for that, because they come up with a solution, but they hadn't come up with any alternatives. So, well, they've perhaps gone part way down the route. And as a result, the cost of the solution, again, they'd only got half of it, because they didn't know what to compare with anyway, because they hadn't worked out the cost of the problem. Had they worked out the value for individuals? No, they hadn't. Had they got buy-in? Well, they'd certainly got buy-in from the managers, and actually there was buy-in from the users, providing it didn't take too much time. Had they involved the users? Had they talked to them? No, they hadn't, and there clearly was a big problem. And did they have any change support plan in place? No. So out of 8 points, they scored a grand total of 3. This thing was doomed. The problems. Let's look at the problems of the proposed solutions. As I said before, there was some things that were just never going to be relevant again. It was just too quirky, too unique. There's no point in capturing all of that. It was time wasting to do so, both for those that are trying to capture the data and for those that were then searching for data afterwards. It's going to capture all your bad solutions as well as all your good ones. So if you do something and it turns out it was a bit of a mistake, you wouldn't know straight away. Chances are you wouldn't know till 3 months, 6 months, a year down the line. It may be a lot later before you actually discover that there's a problem, and yet you wouldn't capture any of that. All you'd capture is what the solution was, ensuring that other people will copy it and do bad solutions as well. And the alternatives just hadn't been considered, and the reasons for the eventual decision. Would the data be reusable? And again, there is a problem. If you're going to actually capture enough data, you're going to have to put in a lot to actually find out whether it's worth, whether you can actually reuse something again. We looked at the possibility that somebody could come up with perhaps 3 alternatives. Why did they go for one particular one? You've got to know, if you're going to reuse this decision again, what alternatives were considered. Why didn't they go for the other ones? It may well be that they went for the solution they did purely because the customer had some particular whim and said, I really like working with this particular software. Or it may be that the person recommended knew that one particular version better than the others. And so they went for a particular solution. Now, unless you know what the alternatives were and why they weren't taken, you can't reuse any of those decisions again. So there's a lot of stuff to be captured. It's going to be time consuming, and yet much of it wouldn't be reusable. Only 10% of it ever would be. So if you look at the problem, it would fail to meet the needs of the experienced analyst because they were going to get very little out of it anyway. They were the ones putting all the data in, and they had no benefit to gain. It was too cumbersome because they'd have to put a lot of stuff in, too time consuming, because they were going to have to spend a lot of time at it, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to get on and deal with customers. And they had no motivation to use it because they were going to get no benefit out of it whatsoever. But that also means it would fail from the novice's point of view, because there was too much redundant data in there, which is going to be confusing. There would be insufficient data, the way it was actually proposed, because it didn't have all about the alternatives. And much of it would be missing because the experienced people would have put it in a rush if they put it in at all. You know, even if they were forced to do it, they would put the absolute bare minimum in, and it wasn't going to be very helpful. So basically, it was not going to get anywhere. This system was going to fail, big time. Okay, so the next question. That clearly was a failure, or would have been a failure. So what would you do? And again, we're going to pause this and we're going to just discuss this in the class here. And at that point, we'll come back and we'll look at some of the alternatives that we thought of. And maybe you'll come up with some new ones. We'll see. Okay, we're back on again. So what would you do? These are some of the things we discussed here at Loughborough. First of all, there's no point in capturing lots and lots and lots of examples if only a few of them are going to be used. So let's decide on a number. Maybe it's 20. We didn't specify. We could say to the company you could take whatever you wanted, maybe 20, maybe 30 examples. The ones that the expert thought were most likely to be reused. That way, you haven't got too many. It's simple to actually search through and find what you want out of it. And the detail could be recorded because you could actually you've got the time, or if there's only a few of them, you could actually afford to give the experts a financial incentive to put it on there. Give them a bonus if they put a new one on. You can afford to do that if you're not doing it on every single case that you've ever come across. More detail could be recorded as a result. So you could look at the alternatives and why you chose one particular one over the other. And the other thing is, if you've got a limited number there of ones that you know are going to be reused more often, well, there's a basis for a good training package. So that's the first thing we talked about. Another thing that was discussed was that, okay, let's just associate with every single one of these examples now a little forum, so that people can ask questions. Now, if the experts are also monitoring this, remember the experts were able to say that they wanted to help the novices, they just weren't prepared to spend a lot of time over it. But just a simple question and answer can often be very quick to do. So if somebody says, why didn't you use this alternative rather than the one you used? It might be that they can answer very simply and easily and say, well, at the time, this software was a bit buggy, so we decided to go with a more reliable system. That might be something that's now changed. And so that would be relevant, something to know. It also means you can update the system. So if you discover a year down the line, well, actually, we thought this was going to be a brilliant solution. Turned out it was a bad one. Well, you can update. You can put a note on the forum. And again, it helps inform people. Now, having that forum there has the other advantage that we can identify areas for improvement in the training, because you can see what questions are being asked and you can see what advice the experts are giving. Well, let's put that into the training. So again, it supports better training for the whole scheme. So that is one thing we've talked about. Let's have a look at another one. Let's rate each one of these examples. Let's use a standard system, a bit like they use on TripAdvisor and the like, where you can say, how helpful did you find this particular example? And you could even do it on the comments that come back as well. How helpful were they? That means that when new people come in and looking for a particular thing to help them, they can see the ones that are most helpful, and that helps them zoom in on those and use those particular ones as a first choice. It also helps your training because it identifies which are the ones people find most useful, and therefore those should be the focus of your training. But it does also help you identify things that are not so helpful as well. And it means that after a while, if you find one or two of these examples are not actually going to be used at all, you can get rid of them. Replace them with something better. And that, again, can help improve your training as a byproduct of that all along. So again, it can be particularly useful. There are other aspects we needed to consider as well. The system does need support. You need to have somebody monitoring it, making sure it's working okay. In this particular case, it could well be that somebody who's responsible for training might be a good person to keep a track of what's going on here, because they can update their training at the same time. But it requires someone dedicated to maintain the quality, to make sure that people are appreciating what's up there, make sure the comments make sense, make sure that the comments pick up enough information to be of use to other people as well, and make sure the ratings give you something that's helpful. So there's clearly some help that's going to be needed along the way. So we said you definitely need somebody in there, possibly somebody who's involved in training as well. Well, we put them to the company. And what actually happened? We'd been thinking about this for only a few months, We went back to the company and said, look, we've got a grand set of proposals which we think is better than your solution. But what we found is the company had changed. Like so many industries, they're always reorganising, and there'd been a bit of reorganisation in this particular company. A new manager had come in and taken over. And he'd looked at the system, and exactly the same alarm bells had rung for him. And he basically decided it was going to fail, and he looked at it and and looked at ways in which he can get around it, other alternatives. He came to the conclusion that throwing technology at this problem would not work, that there was no need to record every single case. He also came up with a discussion forum being needed to share the knowledge. He also believed incentives would help to make sure you got proper good example cases in there. And the incentive, he wasn't prepared to put any financial incentives on there, but he reckons, and probably true, just plain recognition would be a good idea. And so just naming somebody as being, in the newsletter as being particularly helpful, providing a particularly useful example, was enough for most people to actually say, yeah, actually, I'm appreciated, therefore I'll be okay. So that was a slight difference, but it was on the same sort of lines. He certainly believed better training was necessary and that we could help with some of the things we were coming up with here, and that careful maintenance was also needed. It was pretty well 100% exactly in line with what the student had come up with from the university here. Now, in some ways that was a little disappointing because it meant that we didn't revolutionise the company. They were going to do what we were going to say anyway. But from the student's point of view, he had a wonderful verification within the time of his project. He was a final year student, so he wasn't a PhD student, this particular one. Within the time of his project, the manager had come back and said, actually, everything you said, we agree with. The only slight difference being instead of giving financial incentives, they gave recognition incentives as well. But otherwise, it was complete agreement. That's pretty good for a student to be able to not only come up with some good ideas, but then have a senior person in the company come back to you and say, yes, we agree, and that is actually what we're going to do. So what we've learned from the whole process now, just to wind up, is that success and failure does not just depend on technical issues. Even though you're installing some IT, there are other things you've got to take into account before you even implement anything. You've got to look at other factors. You've got to look at the business issues. You've got to look at the personal factors. Now, fortunately for you people, your course is about a lot of that sort of thing. So in the future, you should be good problem solvers out in industry, because you need both sides. You need the business side, you need the technology side, and you also need your skills and interpersonal skills dealing with people, part of this. So in fact, you should be good at this, and I hope you will be when you graduate. And that's all. That's the end of this lecture. So if you wish to stop the recording, that's it.